Islamism, and I'm going to reduce it to the following two. Islamism is an Islamic movement that seeks cultural differentiation from the West and reconnection with the pre-colonial symbolic universe. And Islamism is a term used by outsiders to denote a strand of activity which they think justifies their misconception of Islam as something rigid and immobile, a mere tribal affiliation. The Islamist agenda then mandates a return to a perfect Islam of the medieval period, sometimes erroneously asserted as the time of the Prophet. The intent is to take the spirit of Islam, the soul of Muslim identity, and organize these within the politics of a new world order. Quote, the idea of the Muslim modernists was that the remedy for Islam consisted of a textual return away from the blemishes of the later phrases back to the yearning for truth of the founders of Islam. In this, they found themselves oddly in agreement with the Orientalists. They came to be suspicious of many traditions of Islamic thought and practice that had developed throughout time. The Islamist agenda is encapsulated in a cry for the return to Sharia. And this is pretty complex. First of all, Sharia, which is often translated as Islamic law, there was no Sharia at the time of the Prophet. He didn't espouse or construct any particular madhab or school of law, and the term is not even found in Quranic revelation. Although the Islamist thesis that Islam is religion and state, and consequently necessary, requires the application of Sharia, it does not reflect historical reality. It was and is a hugely effective antithesis to secular ideas and authoritarian regimes. Second, the cry for the return to Sharia at the level of the masses is generally reductionist, collapsing the universal principles of Sharia with the juridical methods and mechanisms of implementation known as fiqh, or the codes that were produced from that fiqh. The root definition of Sharia is the path that leads to water, and water is, of course, the source of all life. It is universal, divine, sublime, and an ideal. The goal of that ideal in society is called its maqasid, or its goal, its objective, and that is justice. So the maqasid of Sharia is justice. A more coherent definition of Islamic law that Islamists are hoping to achieve is actually that they're trying to achieve fiqh. And fiqh is the effort across Muslim history for understanding the universal of Sharia. To distinguish between these two is crucial for debunking the claim that somehow, if Muslim nation-states were to establish Islamic law, then all problems would be solved. Modern Islamic thinkers have been articulating this distinction, the distinction between fiqh, which is the understanding of Sharia, and Sharia, which is sort of the divine order, sort of like the Tao in Taoism. It is the way. But the way is not the law, it's not a code that says strike them 6 times, it's not a formula that says, you can't eat pork. It is something much more sacred, much more sublime, and much more elusive. And so when Islamists say we want to return to Islamic law, and they use the word Sharia, what they actually mean is we want to return to the understandings of that came out of the medieval period. Third, toggling between the universal intent of Sharia and the human, necessarily fallible, subject to change mechanisms of implementation, or fiqh, the Islamist agenda takes license in condemning those who criticize their goals. While they say their goal is to implement immutable divine order, they are justified to say that any who rallies against this irrefutable idea are not believers. However, Sharia cannot be implemented except through the procedural means of implementation, and that is fiqh, which has always been subject to debate and contestation. Fourth, the existence of 4 established schools of thought, or madhahibs, amongst the Sunni Muslims, and at least 1 major school or madhab amongst the Shias indicate that there is no uniformity. In practice, there is no such thing as pure and simple Islamic law. There are Islamic laws, and the means for deriving these in today's context can only be within the context and operation of the nation state. In state, all policies are subject to public debate, including from non-Muslims, no matter if any one citizen or group of citizens are inspired by their understandings of Islam or not. Implementation can only occur by the will of the people, and people disagree. Finally, the distinction should be made between what is in operation in the past and what can be in operation today, and this is a critical point. It must be taken up against those who have the power to enforce their understandings or their fiqh of what is Islamic Sharia. When this power is given to the state, then all state institutions can be used to coerce even what must remain a matter of personal faith and individual consciousness for the believer. Belief itself is lost because learning through various means and then applying it honestly is the foundation of faith. What should be learned ethically could be replaced by the coercive power of the state. Abdullahi al-Naim says, Sharia principles cannot be enacted and enforced by the state as public law and public policy solely on the grounds that they are believed to be part of Sharia. If such enactment and enforcement is attempted, the outcome will necessarily be the political will of the state and not the Islamic law of Islam. The fact that ruling elites sometimes make claims to legitimize their control of the state in the name of Islam does not mean that they are true, end of quote. These reductionist paradigms of return to Sharia are even more critical for women because that would be a return to archaic, pre-modern Muslim personal status law or family law. Against the claim that Muslim personal status law was built upon the maqasid, again, the objective of Sharia, which is justice, the idea of justice is relative to the family structure that was in existence at the time of the development of that fiqh, which was unconditionally patriarchal. In the past, patriarchal extended families was the norm. Even the marriage contract, on the one hand, we like to talk about that the marriage in Islam is not a sacrament, it's a contract, but that contract was a contract of sale in the past. It was not a contract of a reciprocal contract between two equals. Women who follow the Islamist agenda promote the significance of the sanctity of family without offering any analysis of what constitutes family or interrogating whether living families are fulfilling those ideals so often deemed as family values. Accepting the Islamist agenda because its goal is defined as Islam goes a long way to rally others in support. It has the flavor of authenticity. It stands in stark opposition to importation and imperialism of the West. It has the strength of authority by just being called an Islamic response to modernity. However, when the only alternative was the one espoused by more secular Muslim women who disavowed Islam as the solution, or rather see it as the problem, by the end of the 20th century, believing Muslim women may have felt there was no better choice than the Islamist one. Nevertheless, one shortcoming of the Islamist agenda is its inability to articulate and implement a viable system that takes into consideration the global dynamics of the nation-state and the radical pluralism, not only between Muslims and non-Muslims, but amongst Muslims themselves. It relies upon a static monolithic and untenable idea of the Muslim person incompatible with today's notion of the citizen. A citizen is motivated by and constrained mostly by the coherence of a system that allows the greatest opportunity for well-being. In the absence of this, the Islamist agenda will defer to some post-life eschatology or to coercion. Quote, culturalist Islamism assumes a dead culture, a culture impenetrable to other cultures, to historical developments, and unchangeable over time that bears no resemblance to the stunning diversity of social reality, end quote. The seeds of the third voice in Islamic gender reform were already being planted while secular feminists and Islamists were battling it out for whose voice was the most beneficial to the cause of Muslim women's well-being, liberation, autonomy, and citizenship. A meeting was called between these contended voices when I was at the Beijing Conference of Women in 1995. The Islamists who were present applauded the wisdom behind Islam's position on women, and the more aggressive and outspoken, and certainly more aligned to the UN agenda, secular Muslim feminists refused to yield ground to these backward-thinking participants. The meeting turned into chaos. It was impossible to find any common ground. For some reason, each side also felt that more was at stake to preserve their individual perspectives than to find some united agenda for Muslim women who were present and the women they claimed to represent. I, by the way, went off to see the Koreans dance because I don't like chaos, so I didn't. To further clarify the opposing positions, let us look at the larger context of the Beijing meetings, which was to discuss the aftermath and the implementation of CEDAW, the Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. This is another UN human rights document with the intent of gathering global signatories from all nation states and a larger goal to address gross inequalities between women and men citizens in the world. They are considered universal and not subject to individual states. If there is any conflict, and such conflict is inevitable, then women, especially Muslim women, who hope to change gross social and cultural injustices in the context of Muslim majority nation states must support the UN agenda and reject the religion. If the choice is between religion and human rights, then human rights must reign. Religion must be kept out of the debates. To assume that religion would stay out of debates was both naive and dangerous. For one thing, such a response increased the fervor of the Islamists, who also insisted that Islam and human rights are incompatible. For them, there is an Islamic solution for everything. All such solutions were seen as immutable, divine, not subject to debate, and superior to any human-made systems, documents, or international instruments. As if we could really implement God's law without people's intervention and implementation. The negotiation between the objectives of Islamists and the reality of the nation state is captured in a few sentences, again by Abdullahi al-Na'im. That's an interesting book called Islam and the Secular State, which I would recommend if you're interested in how this evolves. In order to be a Muslim by conviction, he says, and free choice, which is the only way one can be Muslim, I need a secular state. By secular state, I mean one that is neutral regarding religious doctrine, one that does not claim or pretend to enforce Sharia, the religious law of Islam, simply because compliance with Sharia cannot be coerced by fear of state institutions or fate to appease their officials. My call for the state, and not the society, to be secular is intended to enhance and promote genuine religious observance, to affirm, nurture, and regulate the role of Islam in the public life of the community. And his nuance between the mechanisms of the state and the ideas of religiously inspired citizens adjudicating in the state is an important one, because whenever you use the word secular, people often assume that it's going to be antithetical to religion. But it's just, as you know, separation of religion and state law. At the International Women's Conference in 1995, the animosity between those who advocated for the international instruments as the sole method for advancing the cause of Muslim women were put face to face with those who advanced for an uninterrogated notion of Islam as their method. The third voice was also present. That voice was in its nascent stage, with no clear methodology or no implementable strategy or objectives. However, more importantly, it argued that the either-or dichotomy did not reflect the overwhelming majority of Muslim women. The idea that there must either be human rights or Islam was false. Surely there are challenges to be launched against the international assertion of universal human rights, but the goal is not to abandon them altogether, rather to read in the nuances. Quote, for human rights to be universal, it must be integral to the culture and experiences of all societies everywhere. Human rights require validation in terms of values in each culture and in terms of shared or similar values of all cultures, end quote. Most Muslim women unquestionably identify with Islam. And this is different in my experience than people of other religions. Yes, people do identify as Buddhists and as Christian, as Taoist, but Muslims, even if they don't do anything that has to do with the fundamentals of Islamic practice, really adhere to this aspect of their identity. And this was really problematic, 20, 30 years ago when people were telling us we had to choose either Islam or human rights. At the same time, many expressed concern over experience of disjuncture between what is promoted as the ideal of Islam and their own lived realities. In the 20th century, these lived realities were increasingly being made public, which was an interesting development. With so much attention, however, the push to disavow Islam was no doubt confusing, if not also confounding. Because of this confusion, I remember that I chose to articulate my position as pro-faith, pro-feminist. I couldn't take one or the other. I was going to take both, and there was no other name in order to be able to claim both, but I wasn't going to be made to take that choice. This third voice was critiquing certain practices and the underlying patriarchal structures in the development of the Islamic canon and Muslim cultures, so they were shunned by the Islamists as one and the same as secular Muslim feminists. And then secular Muslim feminists then shunned us because they considered us the same as Islamists because we wouldn't disavow Islam and our Muslim identity. In fact, this is when the secularist feminist identity became most evident and most coherent. Before this time, with very few exceptions, Muslim women argued as Muslims maintaining a kind of allegiance to Islam or against Islam, but again, Islam itself was uninterrogated. With the rise of Islamism, the uninterrogated notion of Islam took on political force. Those who had been developing along the lines of the global perspective on gender and women's rights began to lean more towards the left. Some were ambiguous about religion, others were religiously nonconforming, still others were willing to negate religion in all forms, including but especially the one they were born in. The fervor of removing Islam from the argument over gender rights moved towards what is now called secular Muslim feminism. This perspective would become more pronounced from this time forward. It's rare to hear of a Muslim woman disavowing Islam in the earliest reform movements. However, in the conflated understanding of universal human rights and the post-Enlightenment distinction between rights and religion, all that was combined and needed to be articulated to make a distinction from the Islamists. Then secular Muslim feminism claimed an explicit identity. As this identification became coherent, the methodology of argument by Islamic resources was abandoned and condoned as backwards. As such, the development of a new, more nuanced, mediated articulation would go unnoticed for some time. In an effort to defeat the ill effects of Islamism with its exclusionary vision of the future of Muslims, international funders and research organizations rallied to the cry of secular Muslim feminists. There was an increase of publications and a burgeoning of non-government organizations. Soliciting funds and publication opportunities for the in-between group was often tedious and with very limited successes. For one thing, the in-between voice was building a coherent methodology and clear objectives. Part of this methodology was to critique the terms Islam and feminism and to interrogate their relevance to the lives of Muslim women. In fact, the term feminism itself became a linchpin. It is interesting to note that neither terms, Islam and feminism, were subjected to more dynamic development initially. However, without this interrogation, it is difficult to distinguish the next development of gender discourse in action. The meeting of Islam and feminism was only possible when such an interrogation was followed through. Heretofore, feminism had to be Western, had to be secular. For those who would develop into or were already self-recognized secular feminists, the projection of feminists like this was not problematic. Similarly, for the Islamists, the projection was unproblematic because it helped fuel their refusal to adopt this title, no matter what the nature of their activism. The reified usage of the term feminist for a period of time made it clear who was who. Likewise, the reified usage of the term Islam was acceptable to both groups. When both terms were challenged, then the edge of the debates could move forward in leaps and bounds. Liberal feminism's position have not, quote, liberal feminism's positions have not adequately addressed how the colonial past continues to inform the post-colonial present, contemporary relationships of domination and subordination and understandings of difference, where treatment of difference is connected to the history of European colonial expansion, end quote. Another quote is, the liberal feminist project of human rights assumes that women's needs and desires are both uniform and universal. Gender becomes a universalizing strategy that argues that all women are similarly oppressed. Gender becomes the axis of identity and vocation, devoid of analysis of economic, labor, ideological, ethnic, political, and other divisions and differences among women. A post-colonial feminist analysis raises questions of imperialist and essentialist assumptions of the liberal feminist project, where third world women, and especially Muslim women, are victimized by their cultural values and practices, and therefore needed to be rescued or rehabilitated. It was easy enough to interrogate the use of the term of feminism as secular and Western. Within its own ranks, these critiques had been developed by third world feminists, religious feminists from faith systems other than Islam, albeit, from African American feminists, from poor feminists, from lesbian feminists in the West. The term feminism had to be shaken from its privileged position of the first wave Western feminist movement to reflect the lived realities of more diverse women than the white middle class. Shaking the term Islamism from its narrow, conservative usage would take longer and in many ways is still unfolding. The crux of feminist responses to larger populations of women globally was already in the core of the term feminism, if it is defined, like Simone de Beauvoir does it, the radical idea that women are human beings. In the international documents for human rights, for example, attempts were being made to articulate a fundamental idea of what it means to be a human being in the context of complex global pluralism. As for Islamic feminism, one of its contributions to the women's movement was the authentic challenge to the understanding of Islam. In gender debates, the other notion that needed to be examined was then the notion of the human being. Fixing upon simple Islamic cosmology as articulated in the Quran, the human being is an agent of the divine will, or Khalifa. Since this is fundamental to the text and the Islamic worldview, why has its application to women been curtailed by other functionary relationships and ideas? The wheels of patriarchy within the Muslim historical context focused upon women's human agency to God only as it manifests in her agency to men and family. Men's agency remained independent or to God, even as family relationships are important to them. The location of this discrepancy can be traced to the development of Muslim personal status law or family law. Muslim personal status law is not, in Muslim personal status law, it's not the person that is adjudicated. It is the status of that person within the patriarchal family. Establishing and maintaining the patriarchal family does not require women's human rights, agency, or even social justice as we understand these today. Perhaps this is the result of women's exclusion from the codification process and the exclusion of their perspectives in establishing the primary canon, as I mentioned to you earlier, so I'm going to skip down. Quote, in classical fiqh texts, women are depicted as sexual beings, not as social beings, and their rights are discussed only in the context of family. The classical fiqh notion of women's rights is nowhere more evident than in the definition of the marriage contract, which treats women as semi-slaves. One can say that the disparity between men's and women's rights in Muslim societies was, and still is, sustained largely through the rules that classical jurists devised for regulating the formation and termination of the marriage contract. In this respect, there is no major difference between the various fiqh schools. All share the same inner logic and conception of family, and that's from Ziba Mir Husseini. The patriarchal family is built upon unequal or complementary relationships. Now, does this complementarity fulfill the divine purpose on earth or achieve agency, the ultimate obligation of all human beings created by Allah? A woman's service to men or family should never be a trade-off for her service and agency to Allah. However, in the patriarchal family structure, the only one known for millennia within Muslim and other cultures, challenges to the autonomy of women's agency are seen as good and natural byproducts of her nature. Furthermore, to reject the patriarchal family would have been the same as rejecting to participate in community or even in Islam. It was not a price the overwhelming majority of women were willing to pay, so they made their peace with it. Eventually, the Islamist agenda would advocate the wisdom of this structure. Even the secularists would acquiesce to it. No one questioned the Islamic origins of this asymmetry. How do we determine if this is the divine intent or the product of interpreters who were limited to and influenced by their own social and cultural realities? Since no articulation of egalitarian family was practiced at the time of the Prophet, developed in Islamic law, or envisioned by secular Muslim feminists and Islamists alike, the notion of family was taken as indisputable. This is where a radical reform was needed. It could only evolve with a rigorous overhaul of the underlying notion of the human being in Islam and of the family. It's interesting to note how Muslim women moved towards all aspects of the public space while still deferring to archaic notions of family in the private sphere. Muslim women developed a bifurcated personality even within the context of the secular feminist movement. Home and family was without question. Public roles, education, politics, and economics had to be challenged for their exclusionary dimension for women. Meanwhile, Islamist women, who brought their agency forward into the public domain as well, acquiesced to notions of family that left them subservient. More importantly, in the public realm, Islamist women advocated loudly for maintaining this deference in the private space. The advocacy was in fact crucial to their legitimacy as activists in the public domain. And by the way, and I'm not getting into it here, this is one reason why hijab and the longer the better was necessary, because it showed that even though you were in the public space, you really were a private person and you supported these notions about the private space. There is no doubt that women's role, and obviously that's not the only motivation for hijab, but you have to understand that there's no Islamist without a hijab. So other people who have hijab also can have other reasons. There's no doubt that, and hijab is the headscarf, there's no doubt that women's roles in Islam are part of the current global debates. More importantly, unlike any other time in history, Muslim women themselves are leading these debates. This discussion looks at the difference between three main voices in the debates. Certainly there are far more nuances that have been addressed. However, it is undeniable that Muslim women themselves are taking control over what the future of Islam and gender will look like. At stake is a fundamental understanding of what Islam intends for women as human beings, agents of Allah, and citizens in the global context. As Muslim women, notions of gender from pre-modern times are untenable. However, the ability to counter such ideas by formulating new ones has gained momentum only within an Islamic framework with the kind of work done under the banner of Islamic feminism. Islamic feminism works to establish egalitarian epistemology of Islam based on its own primary sources and not with the intermediary of patriarchal thinkers. Islamic feminism says, Islam belongs to all of us. All of us have a stake not only in how our religion is defined, but also how religious ideas are implemented in our policies and in our homes. Furthermore, they say, notion about women's subservience are the results of certain medieval constructions, reflecting the understandings of jurists and philosophers at that time, but they are not divine constructions. We are free to understand divine constructions for ourselves and in our context. When we do this, we unveil a broader vista of gender possibilities than heretofore practiced or imagined. And since the time is going to end, I'm going to have to just summarize a little bit about the epistemological basis of the gender reform of Islamic feminism. And it goes back to the notion of tawheed that I introduced shortly. In Islam, we are committed to the idea that Allah is one, and the word that's used for this is the word tawheed. If you leave it as just a kind of a metaphysics, then God is one. It's like any other monotheism. But actually, the word tawheed comes from the second form of the verb, and it's much more dynamic. So it sets up a kind of axis. And on the vertical axis, Allah would be the highest focal point. And no human being could ever be above another human being along that line. So therefore, humans can only have one kind of relationship, and that's a relationship of horizontal reciprocity. Now, it was always interesting to me when I talked about, gender equality, that men would bulk somehow as if they were going to lose something. And the reason was, of course, they were thinking of men and women this way on a vertical line, and you can't exchange that. That is not reciprocal. Once you exchange it, somebody has to be down below. If every human being, and of course I've used this in terms of talking about other aspects of global pluralism, but if every human being is an agent of God, Khalifatullah, then they can only have one kind of relationship with other human beings. And what we've done with this, which again, I mean, trying to go through the whole paper, I'm going to have to skip over this really quickly. What we've done with this is link this with the discourse about the maqasid of Sharia, the goal or the objective of Sharia. The goal of the objective of Sharia is justice. And it is very clear in our time that there can be no justice without equality in the family. Thanks. All right.
I would really like, I know we're coming up against the break, but I think we should just steal time from the break for question and answer. And so what we're going to do is just do 10 minutes of question and answer, and then you have 5 minutes to grab your coffee and, refresh yourself, and then go to the breakout session, if that's okay with everybody. So why don't we open it up to questions for the next 10 minutes. And I've got some mobile mics. Why don't maybe we take 3 or 4 questions, because there's only 10 minutes, and then Amina can address them.
There's a on
oh, that
switch.
one's on.
There's one on switch.
Well, that one, we'll just use that one.
Yeah, well, that one went on.
We'll have their hand up. Okay, we'll start here and then back there. Okay, just leave it. You can just use the main mic, and I'll walk around.
Good morning, Dr. Wadud.
Wadud, sorry. I was married to somebody named Wadud.
Speaking of your last name, you said you chose it, and because it's the name of God is love. So when you were saying that, you said that it was one of her 99 names. I never heard that in my life. They always say,
You're not ready in my work.
Even God himself in the Quran referred to himself as he. So I would like you to expand on this a little bit.
Actually, that's also in the paper. I just, looked up and saw the time on the iPad and realized that I need to do the quick version of the end. In the Quran, it says, with regard to God, "Laysa kamithlihi shay," Allah is not like other things. And in the Quran, it also says, وَمِن كُلِّ شَيْءٍ خَلَقْنَا زَوْجَيْنِ, and from all things we created the pair. Then I take maleness and femaleness as attributes of the human creature, and not as attributes of God, and therefore I use he, she, and it. And it's also interesting to note that even though the generic in Arabic is the male form, including, for example, the generic word for a pregnant person is in the male form, although males don't actually get pregnant. This is a function then of grammar. It's not a function of cosmic reality. And since in the Quran, for example, Allah refers to him or her self or itself in the plural form and is only one, then you know that a pronoun is only a pronoun. In English we have 3, he, she, and it. In Arabic they have 2, and everything must be a he or she, including inanimate objects. So I'm very happy about languages like Bahasa Indonesia or Turkish where they only have 1, because I call those the Tawheed languages. So when I make this analogy about a pronoun is only a function of grammar and not an identification of God, they're much clearer on it. So for what I do in English is I just use all 3, he, she, and it.